Evaluation in the Extreme is quite a unique book in the sense that it's one of the first books, I think, that takes a very deep look at context and how contexts of violence influence the administration of international development or international humanitarian or peacebuilding assistance, for that matter. So it actually asks people who work in these areas of practice to think about how international development assistance affects people who are living in these places, and vice versa, how the things that are going on in these places, often places that are affected by different forms of violence and conflict, right through from things like social violence to very militarized or very intense forms of violence and armed conflict, asks people to think about how those contexts actually affect the work that we're trying to do. This book, I think, makes a few contributions. One of the contributions that it makes, and which I think sets it apart from other books, is it brings together in one volume some of the really important stakeholders who work in countries and settings that are affected by conflict and violence. So when you look through some of the authors of these chapters in this book, these are funders or donors of international development assistance and humanitarian assistance. Donors like the IDRC, for example, donors like the Gates Foundation, donors like Atlantic Philanthropy, which has done a lot of work around the world in Africa and even in Europe. So it looks at those perspectives, but it also looks at the perspectives of people who are on the front lines in these countries. So some of the authors are themselves evaluators who are working in these contexts and are actually looking at how they can undertake good evaluation practice and how their evaluation as an intervention can have positive or negative effects on the good work that we're trying to do in these places. It also asks questions about researchers, because much of the book also focuses on the positive and negative effects of research. So a number of the chapter authors are themselves researchers. And then finally, we also have chapter authors who are practitioners. So are people who sort of basically have one foot in that divide as a researcher, but they've also been evaluators. So there's a lot of changing between these roles. And I think one of the really interesting things is, rather than having these different actors talking across each other, for the first time they come together and they're actually talking about what it means to be interacting as international development practitioners and theorists, academics, and people who are actually trying to do practical things on the ground. This book is really special, for one thing, because, as I said, I think it brings together a very big panoply of actors. And that's one of the things that makes it interesting. But another thing that makes it very interesting, I think, is that it looks at different forms of violence and conflict. So I think that much of the literature, or much of the things that we read about, often talks about conflict and very strong militarized conflict in places like Kosovo or in different conflicts in Africa. But this book actually looks at conflicts in other parts of the world. So there are a number of chapters that actually look at the different effects of conflict on the delivery of international assistance in places like Northern Ireland during its troubles. But it also looks at, for example, how states come out of conflict and violence. So one of the other chapters looks at post-apartheid South Africa, for example, and the funding of research on HIV/AIDS in that immediate post-apartheid time. There are also chapters that look at places like South Sudan, looking at some of the lessons that come out of places like Sri Lanka, when researchers and evaluators are working in places like Sri Lanka. But again, it also looks at forms of social violence. So there's a very interesting chapter in which an evaluator looks at some of the effects of the work that she's doing in a red light district and within a program that's trying to assist sex workers and the children of sex workers in a red light district in Bombay. So we see not only militarized conflict and some of the big conflicts that we see on the screens in our TV, on the TV all around the world, but we also get a little bit of an inside look at the effects of social violence and some of the other sort of perhaps more invisible but equally pernicious forms of conflict.